Chapter 2. Tommy Leach. We used no mattress on our hands, no cage upon our face. We stood right up and caught the ball, with courage and with grace. George Aylard, 1880s. Listen, when you say the name Wagner to me, you better say Honus Wagner. Anybody else you mention Wagner to them, and they know right off who you're talking about. But not me. That very confusion resulted in me almost pulling one of the biggest boners of my whole life. It happened in 1898. I was a skinny 20-year-old kid, only 135 pounds, playing third base for the Auburn Club of the New York State League. About a month before the end of the season, the owner of the club sent down word that he wanted me to come in and see him. Uh-oh, I thought. What the dickens is coming now? I told you I was going to sell you to a big league club before the season was over, he said. And I've got a chance to do just that. 2 National League clubs want you, and I'm going to let you make the choice. Where would you rather go, Washington or Louisville? Well, I said, I'd like to talk to the manager first before I make a decision if you're really going to let me make it. I don't know anything about those clubs, and I'd like to go where I'd have the best chance. That's all right, he said. You won't go until our season is over anyway, and then you'll report to whichever club you pick. So I went to the manager. He was a real old-timer. I don't know whatever became of him. He was a drinking man, and they let him go soon after. I put to him, I just want you to tell me where I'll have the opportunity to show what I can do. I said, I like to go where I'll have the best chance to play third base because I know that's my best position. I'll tell you, he said, knowing what I know, I'd say take Louisville. If you go to Washington, they have a man who's a darn good third baseman. His name is Wagner. Well, I didn't know Wagner from Bean, so naturally I chose Louisville. Our season at Auburn ended a month before the big league season was over. So in late August of 1898, I reported to the Louisville club. I hardly had time to get settled before it hit me that this guy the Louisville club had at third base was particularly doing the impossible. I'm sitting on the bench on the first day I reported, and along about the third inning, an opposing batter smacks a line drive down the third base line that looks like at least a sure double. Well, this big Louisville third baseman jumped over after it like he was on steel springs, slapped it down, and with his bare hands scrambled it after it at least 10 feet and fired a bullet over to the first baseman. The runner was out by 2 or 3 steps. I'm sitting on the bench and my eyes are popping out. So I poked the guy sitting next to me and asked him who the devil that big fellow was on third base. Why, that's Wagner, he said. He's the best third baseman in the league. And when I heard that, did I ever groan. I'm sure it was loud enough to be heard the whole length of the bench. What chances a tiny guy like me have anyway? If here, I thought to myself, Wagner isn't with Washington, he's here. Do you know what happened? There was a Wagner with Washington, all right, but it was Al Wagner, Honus's brother. Honus himself was right there in Louisville. Well, it all turned out for the best, of course, but until you can bet I was pretty sore at the Auburn manager for giving me the benefit of his wisdom. It turned out for the best because I wound up in Pittsburgh on one of the greatest teams that ever played. We won the pennant 4 times in the next 10 years or so, and beat Ty Cobb and the Detroit Tigers in the World Series the last time. You see, after the 1899 season, the National League cut back from 12 to 8 clubs. Louisville was one of the 4 clubs cut out, but Barney Dreyfus, who owned the Louisville club, bought the Pittsburgh Pirates and transferred a dozen of us who were with Louisville over to Pittsburgh. So the Pittsburgh club that started the season in 1900 was mostly the same team as the Louisville club that ended the 1899 season. And it also turned out, while Honus was the best third baseman in the league, he was also the best first baseman, the best second baseman, the best shortstop, and the best outfielder. That was in fielding, and since he did the league in batting 8 times between 1900 and 1911, you know that he was the best hitter too, as well as the best base runner. But to get back to that day in 1898, when I first reported to Louisville, I got into uniform and the manager, Fred Clark, told me to go up and take some batting practice. My own bat hadn't arrived yet, so I just went over and picked one out that I liked and went up to hit. After I was through, I hardly had time to lay the bat down before somebody grabbed me, and I heard this strange voice say something like, "What are you doing with my bat?" Scared the dickens out of me. I looked up, and it was a deaf mute. We had a deaf mute playing center field, Dummy Hoy. His real name was Bill Hoy. You probably read of his living to be 99 years old. I roomed with Dummy in 1899, and we got to be good friends. He was a real fine ball player. When you played with him in the outfield, the thing was that you never called for a ball. You listened for him, and if he made this little squeaky sound, that meant he was going to take it. He married a deaf and dumb girl named Anna Maria, who was a teacher at a deaf and dumb school in Cincinnati, Ohio, which is where they both came from. They could read lips so well they never had any trouble understanding anything I said. They could answer you back too in a little squeaky voice that usually you could understand once you got used to it. We hardly ever had to use our fingers to talk, although most of the fellows did learn the sign language, so that when we got confused or something, we could straighten it out with our hands. I was just a utility player with the Louisville club for what remained of the 98 season. In those days, they didn't take extra players on the road, so when the team went on a trip, they left me behind in Louisville. I was supposed to keep in condition in case something happened, and they sent it for me. Well, I was the only utility player, so I had to try and keep in shape all by myself. What I'd do was, every day I'd go out to the ballpark and take the ball and bounce it up against the grandstand and turn back and run back and forth, playing catch with myself. I did that for hours every day. Of course, I got no hitting practice, but I did keep in condition. When the team came back at home, Fred Clark said, "How about you? Would you like it to get in?" "Sure," I said. "I'd like to see what I can do." So Fred put me in at third base with Honus moving over to first. That reminds me, did you know when Honus Wagner played third, he played it with the first baseman's mitt? I don't know why, but he did. Anyway, I got 2 hits in that game, which surprised me as much as anybody. I only weighed 135 pounds then. I never weighed over 150 in my life. And I'm only 5 feet 6 inches tall. So it took me a long time before I learned how to be a decent hitter. In Pittsburgh later on, I was wee Tommy Leach like Willie was wee Willie Keeler. I still remember in 1896 when I was playing semi-pro ball with Hanover, Pennsylvania in the Cumberland Valley League, I couldn't hit a lick on earth. One day I struck out 4 times straight. Some fellow got at a piece of wood and about half a foot wide and 4 or 5 feet long from someplace. That's when they used to have those rail fences. And when I came up for the 5th time, he presented it to me at home plate. I didn't have enough time and the sense to laugh. I never dreamed that day that I'd wind up playing 19 years in the big leagues and get over 2,000 hits. The odds against it looked pretty big. way bigger than me. So after I got those 2 hits in that first game, I felt pretty good. I went home that night sitting on top of the world. The next day, I didn't know whether or not I'd play again. But as I got dressed in uniform that afternoon, I really had my hopes up. While I was dressing, I went over to the end of the clubhouse and doggone it, there was my bat, sawed into 3 pieces. Boy, was I ever sore. That was my only bat, and nobody would ever let you borrow theirs. Besides, my bat was something special. A kid had made it in school for me and given it to me as a present. I challenged that whole ball club, all 135 pounds of me. I swore I'd rip whoever did a thing like that into 1,000 pieces. And while I was jumping up and down, I happened to look over at the manager, and there he was, Fred Clark, laughing his head off. I never did find out for sure he did that, but on the basis of the way he acted, I still suspect it was Fred himself. He never admitted it, though. Do you know who joined us on that Louisville club in 1899? Rube Waddle. He came up from Grand Rapids in the Western League late in 1899 and spent for the rest of the season with us in Louisville, and part of the 1900 season with us in Pittsburgh. But he jumped the team in 1900, went home to play. It's called Ponxsutawney, Pennsylvania. I still remember the name. Connie Mack finally got him to leave there and made him into the terrific pitcher he became with the Philadelphia Athletics. I roomed with that crazy character for a while. If they thought he was nutty later, they should have seen him then. He was just an overgrown boy. It was a riot. I remember one time he called the outfield in and pitching an inning without any outfielders. It happened in an exhibition game during spring training. Coming up from the south, it was an Easter Sunday, and somebody in the stands threw an egg at him and hit him right on top of the head. You couldn't face that guy, though. He's the only guy I know who appreciated a thing like that. So he showed them how good he was by calling the outfield and striking out the side. I used to stand there at third base and watch him throw. I wasn't playing, I was watching. How can a man throw that hard? I used to wonder to myself. He had a terrific curveball, too, and a great control. Anyway, when the 1899 season opened, I was still with that extra utility man. Pretty soon after the season began, though, the shortstop got hurt, and they put me in there. Well, in my very first game, I made 5 errors, so right after they sent me back to the minors, they loaned me to Worcester, with that understanding that I'd play shortstop. Third base was where I belonged. I knew that all the time, but who was I to argue about it? I'd been playing at Worcester for about 2 weeks, and when about 10 o'clock one night, I got a wire to report back to Louisville. Well, I didn't have any money, so I went to show the wire to the manager of the Worcester club. It took me about an hour or so before I could find him. "How much money have you got?" he said. "I don't have any," he said. "Well then," he said, "you're not going to Louisville if you come to me thinking the club is going to pay you your railway fare. You're wrong. You're going to stay here. I need you." "But I have to report back there," I said. "I'm just here on loan, and they want me back." "That's too bad," he says. "Well," I said, "I guess there isn't anything I can do about it, so I might as well go home and go to bed." And that's exactly what I did. Next morning, though, he came around and handed me the ticket. "It might be your big chance," he said, "so I'm not going to stand in your way. Good luck." And back I went to Louisville. Pretty soon after that, I became the regular third baseman, and I got in over 100 games that year. Hit a respectable .290, too. If I remember correctly, my salary that year was $5 a day, $150 a month, and for the season. The next day, that would be 1900. The next year, that would be 1900. We moved from Louisville to Pittsburgh. We had a little trouble getting rebuilding started that year, and in June we were in last place. Then we started playing the way we should, and we almost won the pennant. Brooklyn beat us out by only a couple of games, even after our bad start. But we did win the next 3 years in 1901, 1902, and 1903. In 1902, we won the second National League pennant by 27.5 games over the second-place team. Even all the years that have passed since then, no club in either major league has ever finished that far out in front. That was the year, believe it or not, that I led the league in home runs. I really did. I had 6. The next year, I did even better. I hit 7. But Jimmy Sheckard beat me out with 9. Of course, I wasn't a home run hitter like you see today. The fields were big then, and if you were to hit a ball between the outfielders and you were fast enough if you had a home run. None of those I hit went over the fence. In 1902, like I said, we won the pennant by 27.5 games. And do you know that our starting pitcher pitched the complete game in something like 130 out of 140 games we played that season? Just think of that. And compare it with today. It's hard to believe, isn't it? We had 4 pitchers and they just took their regular turn day after day and went the distance almost every time. Jack Chesbro, Deacon Phillip, Sam Lever, and Jesse Tannehill. 4 of the best pitchers in baseball. We won 1903. In 1903, again, the 3rd year in a row, and that was the year we were in the first World Series ever played. The very first there ever was. The American League had started in 1901, but the two leagues couldn't get together to play each other until 1903. I hit 4 triples in that series, but it didn't help because the Boston Red Sox beat us anyway. I think they were called the Boston Pilgrims then, by the way. That was probably the wildest World Series ever played. Arguing all the time between the teams, between the players and the umpires, and especially between the players and the fans. That's the truth. The fans were a part of the game in those days. They'd pour right out onto the field and argue with the players and the umpires. It was sort of hard to keep the game going sometimes, to say the least. I think those Boston fans actually won that series for the Red Sox. We beat them 3 out of the first 4 games. And then they started singing that damn Tessie song. The Red Sox fans did. They called themselves the Royal Roosters, and their leader was some Boston character named Mike McGreevy. He was known as Nuff Said McGreevy, because anytime there was an argument about anything to do with baseball, he was the ultimate authority. Once McGreevy gave his opinion, that ended the argument. Nuff said. Anyway, the 5th game of the series, Royal Roosters started singing Tessie for no particular reason at all. And the Red Sox won. They might have figured it was a good luck charm because from then on you could hardly play ball. They were singing Tessie so damn loud. Tessie was a very big popular song in those days. You remember it, don't you? Tessie, you make me feel so badly. Why don't you turn around? Tessie, you know I love you madly. Babe, my heart weighs about a pound. Yeah, and that was a real humdinger in those days. Like, the music goes round and round in the 30s. Now you surely remember that one. Only, instead of singing Tessie, you know I love you madly, they'd sing special lyrics to each of the Red Sox players, like, Jimmy, you know I love you madly. And for us Pirates, they'd change it a little. Like, when Honus Wagner came up to bat, they'd sing, Honus, why do you hit so badly? Take a backseat and sit down. Honus at bat, as you look so sadly. Hey, why don't you get out of town? Sort of got on your nerves after a while, and before we knew what had happened, we lost the World Series. The year 1903 was also the year Honus became a full-time shortstop. Up until 1903, he played almost every position on the team, one day at short, the next day in the outfield. The day after at first base, he didn't look like a shortstop, He had those huge shoulders and those bowed legs, and he didn't seem to field balls the way he did. He just ate the ball up with his big hands like a scoop shovel, and when he threw it to first base, you'd see pebbles and dirt and everything else flying over there along with the ball. It was quite a sight. The greatest shortstop ever. The greatest everything ever. We never finished out of first of the division the next 5 years, but we didn't win again until 1909. That year, we evened it up with the American League by beating the Detroit Tigers in the World Series. They had a very good team, too. Ty Cobb, Sam Crawford, Davy Jones, Donnie Bush, George Moriarty, I think that's how you say his name, and all that bunch. That was a mighty rough World Series in 1909, Almost as rough as the first one in 1903. There were a lot of bad blood between us and Detroit, especially with that George Moriarty. The Detroit third baseman, he was a tough character. It so happened that right about the time I started to get bald. Terrible feeling. I was only about 30 years old when somebody told me that I could stop my hair from falling out if I'd shave it off completely and rub this liniment on my head. I think it was some kind of horse liniment, to tell the truth. So that's exactly what I did just before the series started. It was foolishness, but I did it anyway. Well, in one of those games of the series, I forgot which one, I got a single and went to third on a hit by Honus. I'm standing there on third base, not thinking about anything in particular, when this Moriarty, we'll just call him George for the rest of the story, suddenly comes over and kicks me in the shin. Just like that. He looks at me in surprise and asks him, or I look at him surprised and asked him what was the meaning of such a thing. He walked away, didn't say a word. I had to stay right where I was, of course. I didn't dare get off the base because if I did, they'd tag me out. A few seconds later, I had my back turned, and he comes over again. And this time he grabs my cap right off my head. I was embarrassed. Well, I started to laugh. Well, I said, I got it all shaved off the other day. I wanted to explain to him why there was no hair on my head, But he didn't wait for me to finish. He reached up and slapped me right on top of my bare head with my own cap, too. Boy, that was too much. So I turned around and grabbed my cap and at the same time gave him a good, healthy kick in the shins. We were about to really go to it when the game started again, and I think the inning ended on the next pitch. So that was that. Anyway, as you can see, that horse liniment didn't do a heck of a lot of good. A funny thing about that series, playing second base for Detroit, was Jimmy Delahanty. We had known each other since we were kids in Cleveland. In fact, it was because of his big brother Ed that I had gotten started in baseball in the first place. I was born in French Creek, New York, but my folks moved to Cleveland in the early 1880s. When I was 5 years old, we lived in an Irish neighborhood in Cleveland, and the Delahantys lived nearby. There were 6 brothers: Ed, Tommy, Joe, Jim, Frank, and Willie. All of them except Willie eventually made the big leagues. Of course, Ed was the best ball player of them all. He was a terrific hitter. Once he hit 4 home runs in one game, and twice he got 6 hits in one game. I always admired Ed. As a matter of fact, I still do. Well, the Delahantys lived on a street where there was a firehouse, and all us kids used to gather around in front of it every evening to watch the horses come out for what they called the 8 o'clock call. The Delahanty kids used to hang around there a lot. One day, a baseball man came around the neighborhood looking for Ed. We found out later he was the manager of the Mansfield Club in the Ohio State League. Everybody knew Ed, so when this fellow asked where he could find him, he was told to try down at the firehouse, and sure enough, there was Ed. This fellow evidently asked Ed if he'd like to join the Mansfield Club. Ed said yes. Because that night, Ed didn't come home. He left word for his folks where he was going and what he was going to do. He just took off. Actually, Mansfield isn't too far from Cleveland, maybe about 75 miles. And Ed was about 19 years old at the time, so it wasn't as bad as it sounds. As soon as his mother and father found out what had happened, the first thing they did was come to my father wanting to know what they should do. They were pretty shook up. And they thought they should go bring Ed home right away. For some reason, what they really wanted to do was for my dad to go and fetch him. I want you to get Ed, Mrs. Delahunty told old Dad. He hasn't any business in Mansfield, and he should be here working. Dad started to laugh. He said, "Listen, you've got a boy who he wants to play baseball. He tells you he is working, and what's he doing? He's always out playing baseball somewhere. Give him a break. Who knows? Maybe he can and make the grade." And he wouldn't go after Ed. Well, of course, Ed made it good in a big way. 1 year later, he was up with the Philadelphia Phillies. And from then on, that's all us kids around the neighborhood thought of. He was everybody's hero. It got so that's all Dad could talk about. Ed Delahunty, Ed Delahunty, Ed Delahunty. That's all we heard. I was supposed to be learning the printer's trade. Dad had a job printing shop. He was the outside man and sitting in business, and then he had a printer. And I was the printer's devil. But I loved to play ball, little as I was, and Dad would always encourage me. "If Ed can do it, so can you," he'd say. Finally, when I got a chance to go to Hanover in the Cumberland Valley League in 1896, when I was 18, my father got all excited. I think they offered me $35 a month and board. "You get out of here and go," he said. "Look where Ed Delahunty is." So I went. Not that I had any objections, you understand, and a few years later, there I was playing against Ed, who always had been my idol, and later against Tommy, Joe, Jim, and Frank as well. When I was about 14 or 15 years old, Ed Delahunty was the one everybody in my neighborhood looked up to. Later, after Ed died in a tragic way at Niagara Falls, the big hero of all the kids in Cleveland became Napoleon Lowy. The Cleveland second baseman, what a ball player that man was. Every play he made was executed, and so gracefully, that it looked like it was the easiest thing in the world. He was a pleasure to play against, too. Always laughing and joking, and when the son of a gun was blocking you off the base, he was smiling and kidding with you. You just had to like the guy. You might think this is all a lot of malarkey, but I really believe baseball was more exciting in game back in those days. It was more rugged, first of all. Take the equipment. We had little gloves that would just fit over your hand. Now they have those big nets, and they catch the ball and the webbing, but we had to catch the ball with our hands in the fields. Now, the lowest minor leagues, you have better fields to play on than we had in the major leagues. You never knew how a ball was going to bounce in those days. Lots of times we'd get a rake and go out and rake the ground around our new positions. Our own position, The style of play is very different now, too. We used to play a running game, a lot of bunting, and a lot of base stealing. I stole almost 400 bases in my big league career, and that wasn't considered much at all. Heck, Fred Clark stole over 500 and Honus over 700. All of us one team, mind you, Even the fellows who were considered the power hitters in those days used to run the bases a lot. Like Sam Crawford, the strong boy, he stole about 400 bases. So did other big guys like Jake Beckley and Dan Brothers. Today they seem to think the most exciting play in baseball is the home run. But in my book, the most exciting play in baseball is a three-bagger, or an inside-the-park home run. You used to see a fair number of those in the old days, but now they're the rarest plays in baseball. For sheer excitement, I don't think anything can beat when you see the guy go tearing around the bases, come sliding into third or into the plate with the ball coming in on a line drive from the outfield at the same time. And now that's something to write about.